Hello, everyone. My name is Ed Stever. I'm the president of the National Foundation of Swallowing Disorders. I'd like to welcome all of you here today or this evening, depending on where you're coming in from. I'm also a head and neck cancer survivor with severe dysphagia, which makes it a nice alignment between myself and the foundation. So the mission of the foundation is to improve the lives of all those with a swallowing disorder. And we do that by providing direct patient support, providing educational programs such as the webinar tonight, raising dysphagia awareness, and promoting promising dysphagia research. I'd like to talk for just a minute on the awareness area. June, which is right around the corner, is National Dysphagia Awareness Month. And it's probably the busiest month in the year for the foundation. If you're interested and you haven't already done so, there was a dysphagia awareness t-shirt design contest. About 36 people submitted their design ideas. One was selected, and you have another 6 days or so to order either a short sleeve or long sleeve t-shirt that promotes dysphagia awareness. During the month, there will be a new patient story posted almost daily, and this is an opportunity for you to help, because there's a sponsor behind every story, and the more likes and shares, the more those sponsors have agreed to provide a donation to the foundation. There are 2 webinars in June, one on head and neck cancer and the other on texture modified diets. And then I'm really excited about an end of month dysphagia trivia contest that will be live on June 30th. We'll have more information about that, but there'll be some great prizes in addition to bragging rights for the contest. You will be muted during the presentation, and traditionally, to ask a question, you would click on the blue question mark to type in your question at any time. But Rayleigh and Alicia have asked that where people feel comfortable, that they become unmuted and ask their question or provide their own insight. So that's a little switch up from how we normally run these webinars. The webinar was made free of charge, thanks to the generosity of an unrestricted educational grant provided by Bracco Diagnostics and sponsored by Cranial Rehab and Mara GTX. So I'd like to just take a few seconds to let that soak in and recognize our sponsors. We have two keynote speakers tonight. They've both volunteered their time for this, and we're thankful for that. Rayleigh Robinson completed her master's degree in speech-language pathology at the University of South Florida for her thesis investigating the impact of lingual resistance training in individuals with ALS. Rayleigh continued her academic journey when she joined the University of Florida Rehabilitation Services doctoral program and received her doctor's degree. Upon graduation, Dr. Robinson transitioned to the University of Wisconsin at Madison to complete a phase of a prestigious NIH grant she received under the direction of Doctors Nicole Rojas-Puglia and Nadine Otter. Dr. Alicia Bose is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Florida and Brooks Rehabilitation and has about 10 years of clinical experience specializing in dysphagia management in the acute care ICU setting. She completed her PhD in rehabilitation science at the University of Florida, where she investigated the role of biofeedback in dysphagia management and physiological mechanisms underlying normal and disordered airway protection. And with that, I would like to turn this over to Rayleigh, and I hope everyone gets a lot out of this webinar this evening.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for having us here tonight, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight. This is a really great honor and pleasure for us to be doing this talk, and especially for us to be presenting together. Dr. Vos and I did our PhDs together, and so this is a really cool moment for us to come together and collaborate on this talk, and we're really hoping that it's going to yield some really interesting thought and discussion. So let's go ahead and get started. Here are our disclosures. So when we were preparing for this talk, we were trying to think about what were the most meaningful aspects, the most salient aspects that we really wanted to talk about during this talk. So of course, we wanted to talk about eating and also how eating plays into this bigger concept of energy. But as we were preparing, we kind of kept coming back just to a fundamental question of what is really the purpose of eating? Why are we driven to eat? And I think for, the clinicians in the room, we tend to think about eating from more of a clinical outcomes perspective. And so how safe is the person when they're eating? How efficient? Me and my background and my research interests, I tend to think about eating from more of a physiological perspective. So how does eating play into our energy expenditure, our nutrition, and our overall ability to survive? And then I think for all of us, but particularly the patients in the room, we tend to think about eating more from social aspects, how eating affects our mood and comfort and our ability to move and go about our lives. So tonight, what we're really going to try to tackle is this idea of what is the purpose of eating. In the first part of the talk, I'm going to attack this question more from the physiological perspective. So on a very fundamental level, why do we eat? In the second part of the talk, Dr. Vos is going to take you through more of the clinical perspective of eating and how we tend to think about eating in terms of our clinical outcomes and the clinical setting. And then interwoven between both of our parts, we're going to be trying to represent how the patient fits into this, their individual preference and their individual factors that might affect both of these domains. So let's get started with physiologically, why do we eat? And I think that we can think about eating in terms of 4 different domains. The first one is eating as a homeostatic mechanism. Next, we can think about eating as a hedonistic mechanism. We can also think about what do we get from eating? What do we derive from eating? And then finally, physiologically, if we don't eat enough, what happens? So first, let's look at the homeostatic mechanism for eating. And you might be wondering, well, what is a homeostatic mechanism, or what is a homeostatic regulatory mechanism, as it's often called? And all that really means is that our body functions best when it's in a state of equilibrium and balance, when it's in a state of homeostasis. So indeed, looking at this word of homeostasis, it means balance and equilibrium. And we constantly are having to make small and large adjustments on a day-to-day, sometimes a minute-to-minute basis to make sure that our internal physiologic functions, our internal systems have a nice balance and are a happy equilibrium place. And this is achieved through maintaining desired set points within these different systems. And a set point is just going to be the physiologic value around which we feel most comfortable. This is where we like to function. So if we look at different physiologic variables that get regulated in our body internally, you can see here are some of the common ones. And I think the one that we're most familiar with is core body temperature. We are at our happiest when our core body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. However, I'm sure if you were to take my temperature right now, I'd probably be around 97.9 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's a really important aspect of homeostatic regulation, is that it's not static. There's some normal fluctuation, some normal variation that's expected to occur. So this is not going to be a very static process. Rather, it's going to be very dynamic and ever evolving. Now, last year I moved to Wisconsin and it's very cold here. I think we just officially had our last frost date like last night or maybe even today, which is a good thing. But we've had to rely upon in Wisconsin a furnace in our old vintage style apartment to heat up our apartment. And I think that this furnace actually gives a really good example about how homeostasis works in our body, because we have some sort of set point in the room that we want the temperature to be at. But let's say that the room dips below that and goes to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The comparator inside of the furnace is going to say, I want this room to be at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, but it's actually at 65. Since there's a mismatch, the comparator needs to send out a response, which is going to be to turn the furnace on. After a while, the room is going to start heating back up, and then it's going to reach our desired set point. This information, again, is going to be sent to the comparator, which is now going to detect that there's no mismatch. The desired set point and the input are the same. So because of that, it's going to say that the furnace is off. And this process keeps repeating itself. This surveillance keeps repeating itself. And again, if the temperature dips too far below than what we want, then some sort of response is going to come in to help re-regulate the room, re-regulate the temperature. Homeostasis within our body functions the exact same way. At times, we're going to encounter different internal and external stimuli, and then receptors in our different organs, on our skin, in our different tissues, etc., are going to sense these changes. That information is going to be sent to our controller, which is typically located within the brain. And if there's too big of a mismatch, the controller is going to send out a signal to our effectors, which are our muscles and our glands, and they are going to send out a physiologic response to help re-regulate the system. The majority of homeostatic functions are going to operate via negative feedback. And that's because responses are generated in order to reverse a change. So essentially, disturbances are going to move us off of our baseline, and then we need a physiologic response to come in and bring us back closer to baseline. So we need to reverse that change and reduce that response. So that's why it's a negative feedback. So I think you can appreciate that homeostasis is challenged at times. Indeed, we encounter these different external and internal disturbances to homeostasis that we can think of as physiologic stressors. Thankfully, however, the body is equipped with different functional reserves to help counteract these stressors. And functional reserves are going to be the excess capacity of our cells, our tissues, our organs, etc., that are not used during typical functioning. But if we encounter some type of stressor that places an increased demand on the system, we can tap into these functional reserves. So here's just an example of a general functional reserve found throughout our body. There's an amount of physiological capacity that we use during typical functioning, and then there's a maximum capacity of that structure or system. The difference between the amount that we use typically versus the maximum capacity, that's what constitutes our functional reserve. So let's look at an example of this. Let's say you're my boyfriend and you're about to go to Colorado, as he is, and go on a hiking trip. So clearly from Wisconsin to Colorado, and then he's going to be going up this mountain with, let's say, 2,500 or 3,000 feet of elevation gain. He's going to have a change in altitude, right? So there's going to be some physiologic responses to this change in altitude because he's not used to it. On a short-term basis, his heart is going to start beating faster, and he's also going to have increased ventilation, trying to take more air into his body and increase his oxygenation. On a long-term basis, if he stayed there for, let's say, a week or two, he would actually have to start producing more red blood cells, again, in order to increase his oxygenation and acclimate to this change in altitude. So when he's here in Wisconsin and just going around normally, he's just using the typical amount of his respiratory system, his respiratory reserves, in order to maintain his baseline function. However, when he's challenged by that environmental stressor and that change in altitude, now he's having to tap into his functional reserve and use more of that functional reserve in order to account for this increased demand on his respiratory system and this increased demand for increased oxygenation. So I hope you can appreciate that there's a tremendous benefit of having functional reserves. They're very protective in terms of our health. And indeed, the amount of functional reserve that an individual possesses is actually considered a representative measure of health. And that is because greater challenges to homeostasis are going to move us further and further off of our baseline. So we're going to need greater amounts of functional reserve to bring us back to our baseline. And so increased reserve has actually been shown to protect against the appearance of clinical symptoms in some patient populations. And this is actually seen in Alzheimer's disease and dementia. When it comes to our brain, we have two different types of reserve. The first is brain reserve, which is the actual physical size of the brain. So this is the volume of the brain, the amount of neurons and synapses, et cetera. So the actual size. We also have cognitive reserve, which is the intellectual enrichment, the amount of intellectual experiences that we've had throughout our lifetime, our educational level, et cetera. It's been found that greater amounts of brain and cognitive reserve give individuals an increased ability to tolerate age-related changes and pathology in the brain. There was actually a 1997 study that looked at Alzheimer's disease pathology in those with increased brain reserve. And in those individuals, they did not necessarily have clinical dementia. And this type of study has been replicated and similar findings have been present, that essentially individuals with larger amounts of brain and cognitive reserve can withstand greater amounts of this type of pathology before the clinical symptoms become apparent. So homeostatic regulation sounds pretty good. We have these internal physiologic functions that need to be regulated, and we have mechanisms for monitoring them and regulating them and controlling them. If we're ever in a situation where we encounter something that's very stressful, we also have functional reserves that can be tapped into to help re-regulate the system and help us regain homeostasis. So it kind of sounds like this is a perfect system and nothing can go wrong, right? But of course, throughout our lifetime, there's going to be lots of different challenges to maintaining homeostasis in this process. And so we have illnesses, diseases, acute injuries, and of course, aging itself can actually present a real challenge to maintaining homeostasis. As we lose functional reserve, this process is referred to as homeostenosis. If we look at that word, stenosis means narrowing. So homeostenosis is going to be a narrowing of the functional reserves due to age, illness, disease, etc. And diminished functional reserve is going to make it really difficult to maintain homeostasis and recover from stressors. And as we lose functional reserve, we're going to be incrementally move closer and closer to a precipice point. And we can think about this as a threshold that once crossed, that's where negative health consequences such as incontinence, delirium, and even presumably dysphagia or difficulty swallowing become apparent. So how does this work? Well, from the time we're born until we reach age 30, we have an increase in the amount of functional reserve that's available. And then at age 30, homeostasis ensues, and we have a slow, steady decline in our functional reserves and physiologic capacities across most of our systems and structures. The biggest reserve declines are noted to occur in the heart, the lungs, as well as the kidneys. Now, the steepness of decline experienced by the individual is going to be contingent upon different lifestyle factors and even genetics. So, an individual who's very healthy, works out a lot, eats really well, they might have a more slow, steady decline. Whereas an individual who leads a more sedentary lifestyle, maybe they're a smoker, has very poor nutrition, they're going to have a more accelerated decline. Now, the most important thing that I really like to harp on and point out about homeostasis is that it's not necessarily pathologic within itself. In most of our body systems and structures, we have about 4 to 10 times more reserve than we actually need. So we can withstand to actually lose a lot of functional reserve. However, if too much reserve is lost and we're no longer able to maintain homeostasis because we don't have what's needed to maintain it, then that's where the issue occurs. And actually, the ultimate consequence of not being able to maintain homeostasis is death. However, before individuals transition into death, there's a really important clinical implication that occurs, and this is the compensations for homeostasis. Because as reserve is lost in one system, the body will compensate by relying upon reserves in other systems to maintain function. And this is why individuals end up in a frail state, because they have all of their reserves in use. And so if they encounter some new type of challenge, they're not going to be able to face that challenge because all of their reserves are already being used up to go towards just maintaining their baseline functions. So they are just very vulnerable and they have decreased resiliency to handle any type of new stressor. So this is why individuals transition into that frail, very vulnerable state. So all of this sounds really great and fascinating, but you're probably wondering, well, how does this relate to swallowing? Well, ultimately, swallowing is going to feed into a very much bigger idea of nutritional homeostasis. So inside of our body, we have energy stores inside of our tissue and our fat. At times, information about circulating levels of leptin and insulin that's stored inside of those energy stores is going to be sent out. If those levels are decreased, this information is sent over to our brain, our hypothalamus and feeding centers, which is then going to send a signal down to the stomach to release ghrelin, which is an appetite stimulating hormone. Once ghrelin is increased, we are going to have an increased appetite, so we're going to need to eat. We're going to need to swallow. And that's going to increase our nutrient absorption and help us store energy for later. At other times, however, our leptin and insulin levels are going to be increased. And that information is also sent over to the brain and hypothalamus, which is going to say, we don't need ghrelin to be stimulated right now. And so our appetite is going to be suppressed. So ultimately, swallowing feeds into this balance between energy inflow and then energy outflow, which is the regulation of nutritional homeostasis. So if we put this back into our model from earlier, the stimulus here would be decreased leptin and insulin, which would be detected by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is also the controller, which is going to detect a mismatch in the amount of leptin and insulin that we need versus the amount that we have. That information is then going to be sent to our effectors, which are going to be our swallowing muscles, and we're going to be given this drive to eat and take in food. So I hope you can appreciate that nutritional homeostasis is going to be very contingent upon effectively taking in food, being able to consume food effectively. And so that's going to be contingent upon both swallowing safety as well as swallowing efficiency. However, patients are often presenting with dysphagia or a disruption in their ability to swallow safely or efficiently. And if there's decreased oral intake relative to our energy outflow, then this is going to dysregulate this entire process. So ultimately, dysphagia plays into a bigger idea of dysregulated nutritional homeostasis and a dysregulation in our energy balance. Now, across our literature, there's a little bit of evidence to suggest that we do have homeostenosis or reduced functional reserve that impacts our ability to swallow. It's not explicitly called homeostasis or even reduced functional reserve in our literature, but we can kind of infer from the things that are being said. For instance, in older adults, it's noted that they have sarcopenia or age-related declines in their muscle mass and strength, which makes it a little bit harder to maybe swallow in a timely manner, maybe have some decreased lingual pressures and things like that. Also, there's just declines in physiologic capacities like our tongue and just some of our, airway and swallowing musculature that manifests as a slower time to swallow, a delayed swallow initiation, being less adaptable to perturbations, etc. There's been quite a bit of research too to show that we have reduced lingual pressures in a lot of clinical patient populations as well as in our aging populations. And these things have been shown to increase the dysphagia risk in these different patient populations. So all of this taken together really suggests that we have this homeostasis that's present in these states of aging as well as disease, and those in turn affect our ability to swallow and maintain nutritional homeostasis. So I like to think about swallowing and functional reserve on this kind of theoretical continuum, where on one end of the continuum, you would have adequate reserve and you'd be in the safe zone, whereas on the other end of the continuum, you would have severely reduced reserve and be more so in the danger zone. And so an individual with intact swallowing function would have adequate reserve. Perhaps if you had a mild to moderate reserve loss, you would have presbyphagia or just age-related swallowing changes, and then dysphagia. Or if you had severely reduced reserve, perhaps you have dysphagia or maybe even frail swallowing if we know how to, define that. But I think most of us in the room can appreciate that swallowing doesn't really happen on this nice, neat continuum like this. We have times where people can go from having intact swallowing function to then being severely decompensated and end up in that danger zone. But in a lot of our other physiological systems and structures, the way that we lose reserve and the subsequent clinical manifestations like that do kind of happen on a continuum like this. So I think it's really important that we conceptualize swallowing in the same kinds of ways. So next, let's look at eating as a hedonistic mechanism. So we just talked about this homeostatic pathway for eating, which is really driven by a homeostatic deficit. So this is eating because we really feel hunger. We really feel like we need to eat on a very physiological level, or something might happen. Maybe we'll get a headache or something like that. So we just feel this drive to eat. But oftentimes, I think we're actually eating because of the hedonistic or the hedonic pathway, which is driven by pleasure and reward. So this is just eating because food's available and it tastes good. Maybe there's a plate of nachos at happy hour and you're like, oh, those look kind of appetizing. I think I'll eat some of those. So it's just eating because we kind of want to and because we like the experience of eating. And indeed, there's two really important things that are central to the hedonic control of eating. The first is just the subjective pleasure of eating. We like food. We've had food in the past. We've identified some foods we really like that we really enjoy eating. That information has been sent to these kind of hedonic hotspots in our brain, which say, ooh, we got to seek out more of that food later on because we really liked how that made us feel. So we just really like food now. The other one's a little bit harder to explain. And this is basically just saying, like, I don't know why I need this food, but I just have to have it. And so this reminds me of a lot of times when I'm given a dessert menu and I know I don't need any more dessert, but the chocolate cake on the dessert menu just sounds so good. And I'm like, I don't know why, but I just have to have it. I'm going to get it. So that's just wanting food. And that's also part of the hedonic pathway. So the hedonic pathway is going to emphasize liking and wanting food, whereas the homeostatic pathway is going to emphasize satiation and more of that physiologic homeostatic deficit. So originally, when these two pathways were being studied, they were thought of as two separate and distinct pathways, with the hedonic pathway emphasizing more of the neurotransmitters, how food makes us feel, getting that feedback, and then seeking out that experience later. Whereas the homeostatic pathway was really emphasizing the brainstem and the hypothalamus, measuring those internal physiologic functions, those levels of leptin and insulin, and if they dip too far, then sending out some sort of physiologic response. In recent decades, however, they've come to appreciate that there's a lot more overlap between these two pathways happening, particularly in the brain. There's a lot of integration happening at these different spots of the brain, which is taking information from both of these pathways, integrating it. So they're really working in parallel and working together to initiate and stop the process of eating. So if we look at the hedonic control of eating, we're going to appreciate the fact that it's a very, very powerful pathway. Look at the triggers involved in the hedonic control of eating. The look of food, the smell of food. When we start eating food, the mouthfeel, how it feels and tastes inside of our mouth. And subsequently, all of these are going to play upon neurotransmitters and receptors inside of our brain. And so these are all neurotransmitters and receptors part of the reward system. So once we start to stimulate these, we want more of that feeling. They're really involved in reward and pleasure. And also, these are also part of addiction a lot of times as well, right? So this is a very, very powerful pathway that we're playing upon when we eat. And indeed, it's so powerful that oftentimes the hedonic pathway will undermine and override the homeostatic pathway. And because of this, we are really geared towards wanting highly palatable and energy dense foods. So in recent decades, the hedonic pathway has actually kind of gotten a slightly bad rep because researchers think that it's really responsible for why it's so easy for us to gain weight, but so hard for us to lose weight. Because we want things that taste good. We want things that make us feel happy and taste good. And sometimes those foods just really aren't the best for us. And it's really hard for us to say no, right? It's really hard to be on a diet and restrict yourself, right? So this is a very, very, very powerful pathway. So because of that, the hedonic pathway can be a positive influence. You can use some of these different things that the hedonic pathway is tapping into to really enhance the pleasure of eating and the eating experience, to make it more enjoyable, and perhaps get somebody that may not want to eat a lot to eat a little bit more, because you're going to enhance that pleasure for them. But hedonism can also be a negative influence. Again, the homeostatic system is there to say, this level is too low. We need to eat until we get the levels back up to where it needs to be. But because the hedonic pathway can override that, even when we eat to that feeling of fullness, the hedonic pathway will say, oh no, you can eat a little bit more. You can have that dessert. So because of that, because it undermines it in that way, this can actually lead to overeating and weight gain. There was a study done in 2005 that looked at different qualitative factors that arose when we look at the hedonic control of eating. So they interviewed 9 individuals to get their perspectives on eating. And there were 3 kind of main factors that jumped out as being really important to the eating experience. The first one was just the stimuli associated with the eating experience, the person themselves, and then their responses to food. So there were foods that people really liked and enjoyed and continuously sought them out throughout the lifetime. The environment was really important to eating. So if you were in like a really well-lit room, very warm, there were birds outside, trees, or if the table was set really beautifully, this all enhanced the eating experience. And then social factors. I think we all can appreciate that food is best enjoyed in the company of others, particularly people that we're familiar with. So coworkers, friends, colleagues, significant others, whatever it might be. Then there was the person's individual attitudes towards hedonism. So just some people would say things like, I cannot even imagine a life without the pleasure of eating. So they had a really positive view of hedonism in their own lives. And then the person's just mood and overall state of well-being when they went into the eating, and they felt like eating gave them a lot of comfort and was really there for them, during different times of their lives when they needed it. So just the state and how it can change your state and well-being. There's a lot of preparatory activities that go into eating. I can tell you that recently we were talking about what we want to make for dinner already on Christmas Day of this year. So that's months and months away. But I'm already looking forward to that prime rib we were talking about. So we do a lot of preparation in terms of buying food and then really setting the intention to enjoy that food. Eating characteristics themselves. So eating a meal slowly so we can enjoy it more, but also things we might do before and after eating, taking a walk, drinking some espresso, having a little bit of dessert, things like that. And then also just the subjective experience of eating. How did the food make you feel? So if we take a step back, we realize that there's a lot more going into eating than just the act of eating themselves. We kind of create these whole rituals around the eating experience to make it a lot more pleasurable. So this creates kind of an interesting conundrum for our patients, because oftentimes they're put into situations where maybe they're getting food that's maybe not the most best looking, maybe not the most palatable. They have thickened liquids, again, that don't have the best mouth feel. And then sometimes they find themselves in hospital settings, long-term care facilities, where the setting itself, there might be medical equipment around, the lights are more dim and dingy, it may smell more sterile, things like that. But they probably want to be at home in a nice, clean, warm environment, and then eating foods that are highly palatable, very exciting and enticing to look at, and then finishing it off with a nice, smooth glass of wine. So from a clinical perspective, which we'll talk about a little bit later, are we tapping into the hedonic pathway enough when it comes to our patients and their eating experiences? Next, let's look at what we derive from eating. So we've talked about these two different pathways and their respective drivers, but ultimately they are going to work together and converge so that we eat. But then what happens next? Well, the long and kind of short story is that it creates energy that we can use and distribute. Typically, when I present on this, I just talk about nutritional homeostasis on a very kind of surface level. And I say that it's the balance between energy inflow and energy outflow, which is accurate, but it's only telling part of the story. Because if we actually look at that energy outflow, it's actually total energy expenditure, which a lot more goes into. We have the amount of energy that we're using for our activities, as well as the amount of energy that we use just when we're at rest and just our background baseline functions are occurring. We also have the thermic effect of eating, which is the amount of energy that we burn after a meal. And then we have our baseline or basal energy expenditure. And that means within a 24-hour period, how much energy are we going to have to use just to fulfill our baseline and our activities of daily living type tasks. So there's a lot more that goes into that energy outflow component than I typically talk about. And indeed, if we look at our body energy requirements, there are a lot. Energy is needed for essential functions like cell growth and repair, respiration. And then if we get some sort of fever or infection, the body is going to have to use energy to make new proteins and new cells within the immune system to help fight that infection. We also need energy for our activities of daily living. So washing, getting dressed, walking, exercising, things like that. We use about 60% of our energy reserves to go towards resting metabolism and just our baseline functions every single day. 32% then goes towards our physical activities, and then about 8% goes towards that thermic effect of eating. So taking all of this into consideration, looking at our body energy requirements, it's going to be so essential that we possess adequate energy stores and energy reserves in order to maintain adequate function. If you're so interested, the Institute of Medicine actually has developed these standard formulas for men and for women to show how much energy requirement an individual has, how much is their total energy expenditure. And you'll notice there in the formula, there's a value referred to as physical activity. So you can actually calculate your physical activity levels, again, for men as well as women. If this seems a bit complicated, have no fear. There is actually an estimated energy requirement calculator that you can use. And really why I wanted to show this slide is because if we think about it, every single task that we do has some sort of energy cost, right? So we can think about our total energy expenditure, our total energy requirement throughout the day as this large energy budget. And every time we do anything, even when we're just sitting down doing nothing, there's some sort of energy expense that comes with that. So I really love this spreadsheet and this calculator because it shows how everything seems to add up over the course of the day and how much energy we actually need to be taking in so we have adequate energy to send out to the world to do the things that we need to do. We need a lot of energy, but does it matter where our energy comes from? In other words, does it matter what I eat? And my response to that is yes, it absolutely matters. When we think about the type of nutrients we need to be taking in, there's two essential types. The first one is macronutrients, and the second one is micronutrients. Macronutrients we need in relatively large amounts, and this is going to provide the bulk of energy needed by our metabolic system. Whereas micronutrients and so these are going to encompass protein, fat, and carbohydrates. Micronutrients, on the other hand, are needed in relatively small amounts, and this is going to help with growth, our vital functions, as well as disease prevention, and this is going to encompass vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. So again, if we take a look back at this slide that I typically show, it's not just about energy inflow and energy outflow. It's about having adequate amounts of our energy inflow in the right areas, getting enough macronutrients, getting enough micronutrients, and making sure all of those are in balance. And then eating enough of those things so that we have enough for our very massive energy requirement and energy expenditure that we experience throughout the day. So when we look at this balance between eating and energy, we really need to make sure that the amount we're taking in is going to be adequate enough to cover the amount that needs to go out. They need to be in balance or it's going to be an issue. So that leads us into this final domain of physiologically, what happens if we can't eat enough? Well, clearly this is going to be an issue for individuals with dysphagia or swallowing problems, right? Because it's going to make it really difficult to get that adequate energy inflow. And so dysphagia is ultimately going to contribute to an energy imbalance. But what does that mean? What happens to our body? Well, we can get some clues from some different evidence and studies that have been done, throughout the different decades. The first one, which I find really interesting, is the ebb and flow trauma theory. So this basically states that after somebody experiences trauma, there's going to be an ebb phase, which is in the very short few minutes and hours and day right after somebody experiences trauma. There's going to be a decline in body temperature and oxygen consumption. And those are initiated in order to try to help reduce post-traumatic energy depletion. So trying to preserve as much energy as possible, in order to deal with the flow phase, which comes a little bit later and is on a more long-term basis. During this flow phase, the body will respond by having increased metabolic turnover, immune system activation, and hepatic acute phase response. And all of these cause increased oxygen consumption and energy expenditure. So you kind of save, and then during that flow phase, you have to start using up a lot more of your energy to deal with that trauma. So the body has to start using this energy in different ways when it's not able to get adequate energy inflow in these very traumatic based states of illness. The other one that's very interesting to me is the selfish brain theory. So essentially, if we go through some very traumatic, stressful event, if we're in some sort of disease state, and there are fluctuating levels of energy, and again, we're not bringing enough in, the brain is going to be very selfish and only care about prioritizing its own energy needs. So that's why it's called the selfish brain theory. It's very selfish in this respect. Now, granted, the brain is very important, so we can't blame the brain for wanting to take that type of approach. But I think both of these just highlight that when there's some sort of disease, illness, energy, and there's some sort of inadequate energy inflow, or we are forced to make decisions about how to use our energy, and the body is going to say we have to start using our energy differently and prioritizing different types of tasks. Ultimately, too, I think when there's inadequate nutrition and energy inflow, this really sets our patients up for a very vicious cycle where they have inadequate nutrition, so therefore they have an imbalance in energy. And then secondary to that, they're not going to have adequate energy reserves. And as we just saw, we need a tremendous amount of energy and energy reserves to get through our day. So then they're going to have difficulty performing tasks and executing sometimes even baseline functions. Then they're going to have weakness and fatigue because if they're not able to do as much, they're going to be spending a lot more time leading a more sedentary lifestyle. And that's going to further exacerbate the energy imbalance. Then moods can be affected. And as we just saw, mood is a very big part of eating. So you may not want to be eating a lot. And again, this vicious cycle just keeps happening and perpetuating itself. I think on some levels that patients are aware of this energy imbalance and how it affects their ability to function. The first reason why I think they're aware of this is because of what I call the money analogy. Typically, when I talk about homeostasis and I present on this topic, I usually start by using a money analogy. And the reason why I started using that was actually because of one of my patients with ALS. He came to clinic one time, and we had only seen him about 2 weeks prior, and he was still relatively early on in his disease, and he was more of a spinal onset, so we wouldn't have expected him to have such a drastic change in his appearance and functioning in a 2-week basis. But he came back to us 2 weeks later after we had just seen him, and he looked like a completely different person. His energy levels were very low. He just looked very downtrodden. So we had a discussion with him, and he said, I feel like every single day I only get $200 in terms of my energy. And I have to be really careful how I use it up, because if I use up all of my $200 by noon, I'm spent for the rest of the day and I can't get any more money until tomorrow. So he was aware that because of his ALS disease process, he wasn't getting enough energy in. And because of that, he was having to make decisions about how to use his energy and use it differently, because he just didn't feel like he had enough reserve, didn't feel like he had enough energy stored up that he could be using for his tasks and activities of daily living. A few months after he came to clinic, we actually transitioned to a model where we started seeing all of our ALS patients earlier in the morning, because this was a common sentiment shared by a lot of them. It's just so exhausting for me to get out of bed and get dressed and drive here that by the time I get here for an appointment, I'm really spent. So we figured if we could get them in the morning and capitalize on some of that energy budget that they had left to spend, maybe we would see better clinical outcomes. Another reason why I think patients are aware of this energy imbalance is because of the spoon theory. The spoon theory was developed by a woman with an autoimmune disorder, and essentially she told her friends, I feel like I get a set number of spoons every single day, and I have to be really careful how I use those spoons and budget them out to make sure I'm able to do the things I'm able to do. So it's very similar to this money analogy, right? You feel like you have this fixed amount of an energy budget or spoons or whatever it might be, and you have to be very careful about how you prioritize those different tasks. So here's an example of the spoon theory. Essentially, every single task has some sort of spoon or some sort of cost associated. So let's say you only get 12 spoons per day. If you get out of bed, if you bathe, make and eat a meal, and then go to work or school, you've already used 10 out of your 12 spoons. So this creates a very, very hard and difficult thing for patients to be navigating when they have these different energy imbalances, because we rely upon our energy balance so much in our body. So if patients have inadequate nutrition and energy, they are going to have to make decisions about how to use their energy, or as we saw with the trauma theory, as well as the selfish brain theory, the body may make that decision for them. So as clinicians, how will this impact treatment and assessment when we're seeing our patients? How do we ensure best performance? Like I said, eventually in our ALS clinic, we shifted to just seeing our ALS patients in the morning. Me, myself, I actually have 2 long-term chronic illnesses, and one of them is a pulmonary illness. And I got diagnosed with this at the height of my PhD program. So you can imagine how devastating this was, because one, I mean, it's just difficult to have a disease. But 2, I was a busy student. I really didn't have time to be sick. I told my doctors this all the time. I was like, I don't have time for this. So anyway, my doctor was always really aware, however, of my energy levels, but also my energy needs throughout the day, what I had to do as a student. So we came together, and we made the decision that if I ever needed a procedure done, I would always get it done on a Friday morning. And the reason for this was I never had any classes on Fridays, never had to see any research subjects on Fridays. So that would give me the rest of Friday as well as Saturday and Sunday to kind of recharge my batteries, rest and regroup, so I would be ready to get back in there on Monday. But we had to come together and make that decision together, and he had to be really aware of my different energy needs. I think when it comes to this idea of energy inflow and having enough energy, however, we tend to think about it a lot in terms of the quantity of food that an individual is taking in. But I would also argue that equally important to this is also the quality of food that an person is taking in. There was a systematic review done a few years ago looking at the nutritional determinants of frailty in older adults. And what this found across these different studies was that low intakes of specific micronutrients, such as vitamins A, D, C, as well as folate, were associated with an increased frailty risk. Also, individuals who had a higher protein intake, so more of those macronutrients, had a lower risk of frailty. Individuals with a better diet quality had a lower risk of frailty. Individuals with an increased dietary antioxidant capacity also had a lower risk of frailty. And finally, individuals who were malnourished had increased frailty as well. So again, this taps into this idea that it's not just about how much our patients are eating. We also need to make sure that they're eating enough of the right things. So for the speech language pathologists, the clinicians in the room, I understand this is a lot to think about. These considerations about the patient's energy levels, their energy reserves, what type of diet do they need to be on in order to make sure they're getting enough macronutrients, getting enough micronutrients. Some of these things may go above and beyond the scope and the training of the SLPs. However, all of this information is needed when we're working with our patients with swallowing disorders and implementing some sort of treatment and management plan. So what Dr. Vos and I really are going to advocate for is a multidisciplinary collaborative approach where you also involve the dietitian, because dietitians have direct training in nutrition and dietary management. So they're going to be able to assess the patient's nutritional needs and help you design a plan. So you can work on the part of the plan that's saying, this person's swallowing looks like this. And then the dietitian can work on the part of the plan that says, these are the types of things that the patient needs to be eating based on their disease, based on the type of medications they're on, based on, the type of energy levels and energy expenditure and requirements that they have. So then you guys work together to say, is your swallowing therapy helping to prepare the patient to swallow and eat those kinds of things that they actually need? So it'll really enhance the experience for the patient as well as for yourselves if you can implement this patient-centered, multidisciplinary, collaborative approach where both the swallowing needs as well as the dietary needs are both considered. So when I was younger, a really popular motto was, you are what you eat. But I think what they actually meant to say was that your energy comes from what you eat, and eating enough of the right things from a physiologic perspective is going to give you the most bang for your buck to make sure you have adequate energy stores and energy reserves so you can go out there and do the things that you need to do. So I know that was just a lot of information that I took you through. So I just want to hit you with a couple of key points here at the end for my part as a nice summary. Homeostasis, that balance and equilibrium, is essential to our lives and gives rise to all of our different functions. And eating is one of the most important homeostatic functions that we carry out on a day-to-day basis. But equally important to just eating on a physiological level is also the pleasure of eating, the experience of eating. And we need to tap into that in order to enhance the eating experience. Our body uses our energy in very, very specific ways. So it's important that we understand our patients' energy levels, their energy reserves, and their energy requirements every single day so we can develop a patient-centered, collaborative approach and tailor our treatments accordingly. If our patients have inadequate nutrition, this inevitably is going to create an energy imbalance in our patients. So this means that the individual and their body are going to have to prioritize the most meaningful functions. But lastly, and probably most importantly, it's not enough to just eat a lot. We also need to make sure that our patients are eating enough of the right things. And we really need to make sure that we, from a swallowing therapy rehabilitation perspective, are preparing them to make sure they are equipped with the tools, the skills, the education to make sure they know how they can get those types of nutrients into their body. It's been my pleasure presenting this part of the presentation to you all. Now we're going to shift to Dr. Vos's presentation, and she's going to take you through a bit more of the clinical aspects of this, and then we're going to have some fun discussion points interwoven throughout her part as well. So with that, I'm happy to pass the mic to Dr. Vos.
Alicia, you're muted.
Well, that's not very helpful now, is it?
You got it.
Liz,
Thanks.
just tell me when you can see my full screen. 1 second. Okay, Liz, can you see my full screen, not just the notes?
I can see just a white screen right now.
Okay. Let's try this one more time. I'm gonna shut my camera off, I think. How's that?
Let's see.
You see it?
I'm only seeing a white screen.
I don't know.
Right now I can see your main screen, your keynote screen with the slides on the side.
That is so strange. Okay. 1 second. I'm gonna try this one more time. So working now? No, it's showing a white screen. Oh my gosh.
I'm sorry. We had practiced this right before the call too.
I know, I know.
Fine. Let's see. Trying to think, if you have the slides, you could send them to me and I could play them from my computer perhaps.
Let me just, I mean, this should work. Hold on.
There we go. That looks good.
Okay.
Awesome. You got it. Thanks, Alicia.
Perfect. Yeah, okay. So we're gonna switch gears just a tiny bit, and we're gonna talk about the role of the SLP. So when we think about the role of the SLP, we think about two main goals that we have as speech pathologists. From an assessment standpoint, we're diagnosing pathophysiology that contributes to unsafe or inefficient swallowing. And really the goal of dysphagia treatment is to maintain adequate nutrition for the patient and also to maximize airway protection. So let's pull out these two main concepts and think about it. So maintaining adequate nutritional intake and maximizing airway protection. So in an ideal world, we would make decisions for our patients that really balance these goals. But in reality, as a field, it seems to be skewed a bit more like this, where we prioritize airway protection above all else. And I know some of you are probably thinking, that's not true, because you mentioned in the definition that swallowing efficiency is really important and residue really matters. That's something that we're constantly evaluating. But I think if you stop and reflect for a moment, when you have a patient that has significant residue, are we primarily concerned about nutrition, or are we concerned that the residue is going to become an aspiration issue? So how many times have you read this statement? Patient with significant residue following all bolus trials and therefore high risk of post-swallow aspiration. It's something I commonly read. And I think a part of that is just our tendency as speech pathologists and through our training is to really focus on airway protection. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I think we need to shift to a little bit more of a balanced perspective. So let's take a look at this video and just think about this point a little further. Now, I think that most of you would agree that when we think about airway safety and swallowing efficiency, we would pretty much agree that this is a pretty inefficient swallow. Now, did anyone's immediate gut reaction think, oh my God, how is this person going to get the micronutrients needed to sustain homeostasis? Probably not. How many of you were actually staring at the laryngeal vestibule in the airway, eyes lasered on that area, thinking, when is this bolus going to spill over into the trachea? I was one of those people. I've spent my whole career studying airway protection, and that's just where my eyes and my brain tends to really focus on. So oftentimes when we think about inefficient swallows and residue, it's often in the context of aspiration. And that's because we tend to prioritize swallow safety, and we don't think as much about how our decisions about diets and compensatory strategies affect our ability to maintain that adequate nutritional intake. So why don't I just beat a dead horse here and take it one step further? So if we think about this patient video, and some of the recommendations that might be made for this patient, we think of, okay, I want you to swallow 3 to 4 times per bolus. I want you to do an effortful swallow with every bite, maybe do the Mendelssohn maneuver to try to open up the UES, to try to manage that residue. And these, these recommendations are common, and a lot of them are really legitimate strategies to provide for patients. But if we bring it back to the spoon theory, some of these recommendations are really going to require a lot of effort and energy from our patients. To do an effortful swallow for every single sip is not something that we should be taking lightly in a recommendation. If we come back to that spoon theory, are we really thinking about the big picture and what we're asking our patients to do? What we may be asking them to give up from an energy and reserve standpoint? If we ask our patients to do a ton of these maneuvers, I mean, often I'll see a combination of all 3 of these things for a patient. We have to ask ourselves, how much of an impact is this really making on the swallow, and what the trade-off is? Or are we just trying to tweak the swallow and make it just a tiny bit better, but we're asking them to do a lot more? So there's this trade-off between what we're asking our patients and how much of an influence it's making on swallowing physiology. There's no right answer here. Rayleigh and I, part of our goal of this talk is to just have us be thinking about these things. So I think part of our goal is that perhaps in dysphagia management, we should still prioritize swallow safety, but really balance it out with thinking about maintaining adequate nutritional intake when we are counseling our patients. So the question is, are we really considering nutrition and the purpose of eating in the first place when we work with patients who have dysphagia? So I don't know about you, but this was definitely me listening to Rayleigh's talk, thinking about all the times I've placed patients on thickened liquids or restricted diets because, quote, that's the safest option for them. So I know as I've grown as a clinician throughout the years that, and especially learning so much from Rayleigh in our PhD about these concepts, like really molding not just airway safety, not just looking at residue in an airway safety context, but thinking about the bigger picture of wanting our patients to get the best nutrition possible and how we can facilitate that. So let's just take a moment and just talk about the impact of modified diets. So, Rayleigh had mentioned the cyclical nature, and I just want to summarize that real quick, which is that, so dysphagia we know is a significant predictor of malnutrition. We also know that modification of diets can predispose patients to malnutrition and dehydration. This in turn can often lead to muscle wasting, which can be associated with malnutrition and then can lead to dysphagia. So it's the cyclical nature of malnutrition and dysphagia, and emphasizing the management of one while ignoring the other may result in increased illness. And it's something that maybe we're just not thinking about enough. That if we're really just focused on the airway, if we're really just focused on the swallow and not the big picture and working with other team members, there's a potential that we may not be giving our patients the best bang for their buck and promoting their overall health and wellness as much as we think that we are. When we think about the nutritional content of modified diets, these are just like kind of pieces of information that we should be aware of, which is that studies can show that textured altered diets contain fewer nutrients than unrestricted regular diets. This is pretty significant considering up to 36% of individuals receiving post-acute care are prescribed textured altered diets. Specifically compared with a regular diet, a pureed diet in particular can have significantly fewer calories, less protein, fewer lipids. And, I just think back to everything really said about the importance of these macro and micronutrients that are essential to maintain the vitality of our patients. And further, individuals consuming altered diets have a 17 to 37% lower caloric intake than individuals consuming a regular diet. So overall, patients on a modified diet, they can have this significant lower nutritional intake, and that can really, again, feed back into that cyclical nature. And, having practiced for a long time, I know how easy it is to get stuck in our own silo as speech pathologists and say, well, the patient is having a little bit of difficulty with mastication. I think maybe a mechanical soft diet would just be a lot easier for that patient. And so let's go ahead and do that. And we think, oh, they'll be able to eat more, but we're not thinking about, well, what's the content of what they may be consuming? And we're really altruistic in these recommendations, but I think without considering the big picture, our perspective may be a little bit skewed. So why might these modified diets contribute to dehydration or malnutrition? Well, there's some work done by Julie Cachero who showed that thickened liquids can have a variety of starch or gum-based products that may impact their ability to quench thirst. They can impact the flavor. They can create a feeling of fullness that leads to dehydration. The suppression of flavor can decrease the motivation to drink, and this can also result in decreased just overall liquid consumption and lead to dehydration. So there's a lot that can go into this. And I think back to, this was a slide from Rayleigh where she talked about this hedonic control of eating and this conundrum, and it really made me think, sometimes when we talk about, we don't want our patients to be eating pureed diets. We want them to be on an unrestricted diet as much as possible. But in the instances where they do need to be on modified diets, there's a lot of emphasis on, well, we should make it as palatable and look as normal as possible for quality of life. And we kind of put patient dignity, quality of life into this like separate box. And what I've learned a lot from hearing, the information that Rayleigh presented is, wow, this is so much more than just quality of life and patient dignity. These things are really important. But if we think back to what she taught us about hedonic eating, the drive to eat to obtain pleasure, and I love this slide that she showed, that there's really this conjunction of pleasure that influences the homeostatic deficit, and together, that is what the combination of these things together is going to really lead to the ability to get these micro and macronutrients. So they influence each other back and forth. It's not just a quality of life and we want them to have normal foods because it's pleasurable. It's actually like really physiological. So as we kind of wrap things up, I just wanted to throw out some sort of thought-provoking questions. And one of the things that Ray and I talked about was, should we as speech pathologists be performing a cost-benefit analysis for every patient? So thinking back to the spoon theory and the brief example I gave before, let's think of an example that's more specific to kind of highlight this. So let's say you have a patient that with all thin liquids, they have deep penetration to the vocal cords. It's not ejected during the swallow due to, we'll say, impairments in laryngeal vestibule closure. And that's just what they have on all liquid swallows. So we have some options. So on one hand, we could do nothing and say this patient is fine and no intervention is needed. But say when they do a head turn to the right, their PAS of 5 goes to a PAS of 3. Okay. But then if they do an effortful swallow on every sip, they have no penetration or aspiration at all. They have a PAS of 1. All right. And then in another instance, okay, well, if they have nectar thick liquids, then they also have no penetration or aspiration, but it doesn't require them to have any maneuvers. So these are all like real situations that you could test in fluoro and come up with all these different options. And as a speech pathologist, I think we put so much on ourselves to pick the right option for the patient. And often we're not thinking about well, if we come back to the spoon theory, how do we layer this out for the patient to say, well, if you do nothing, if you decide that this is how you're going to swallow, you're not going to use any spoons. A head turn to the right isn't going to eliminate penetration, but it's less spoons. An effortful swallow in every sip, that's more spoons, but you don't have to have nectar thick liquids, and you can have regular liquids, but it is going to be more, there's going to be more of an energy cost. Or maybe somebody wants thickened liquids, and they can eliminate penetration or aspiration as well, and not as much energy. So these are complex decisions that we have to make. And I think the point of this whole talk is that we don't need to be making these decisions for the patient. We should be making these analyses with every patient, and more importantly, to have a team-based decision-making approach, to talk to the primary physician, to talk to a dietitian, to be the speech pathologist, to consider the multitude of factors that are unique to the patient. So I hope when you were listening to these options, you were thinking, well, it kind of depends. Maybe if a patient is up and mobile and they don't have any, pulmonary risks, maybe nothing is the right option. But that kind of just requires a conversation with their doctor to understand what their pulmonary risk factors are. And then consulting with the dietitian to say, like, what is their functional reserve like and their energy capacity? What is their risk of malnutrition and dehydration if they go on thickened liquids? What is the patient desires? So I think it's just really important that we don't have a siloed perspective on just thinking about, well, what's the thing that eliminates aspiration and protects the airway the most? Because that's a really narrow perspective. And, I think having this team approach is just really the best thing that we can do for the patient. So it begs the question, should we even be telling patients what they can and cannot eat? This is a common practice that we have to kind of write out what our diet recommendations are. And I think if we take a step back, having these multidisciplinary conversations means perhaps we can just lay out the options for the patient so they can choose how many spoons they want to use. I know it's kind of a tricky question, but it's one that we should think about. So how many times have you seen a question like this before? Is ice cream a thin liquid? I need to let my patient know if they can have it or not, so that I can tell the patient if it's, if they can have ice cream or not. And if you think about it from so in my postdoc, I've been working a lot with physical therapists, and I think a lot of what we do as speech pathologists, and what if a physical therapist said something similar? So an example would be, hey guys, does anyone know if the corner of Main Street and Fifth Ave has any broken pavers? Because I need to make a list of all the places my patient should avoid. That sounds crazy, right? Like, physical therapists don't do that. So, and the reality is just laying out the options for our patients to say, like, this is what the list of levels of risk, that come with every option that we have, and really leaving it up to the team and to the patient. I just really love, Rayleigh in her presentation earlier, she said, we have an opportunity for collaboration to prepare patients to swallow and eat the variety of foods necessary for function and survival. And I just, that really kind of hit home with me. That's something she literally just said like 15 minutes ago. That perhaps, not being so restrictive and just saying, like, these are the things that the patient needs. What can we do to give them the opportunity to participate in complex textures and liquids that, even though they may be challenging for the patient, that they're just as important for them to be able to have the opportunity to try to eat them, and how can we best facilitate that? So we're going to kind of just shift, and we're going to open up some HHQs. So these are hard-hitting questions, what Rayleigh and I talk about all the time. We'd really love for anybody to chime in at this point as I kind of bring up some questions as we think about these big picture ideas and balancing all these things together. So if you have a comment or a question, now's the time to unmute your mic and participate, because we'd really love to hear some of your thoughts. But to get started, I'm going to ask Rayleigh a hard-hitting question, which is, Rayleigh, do you think that SLP should be required to obtain education in nutrition, or be required to screen patients for the presence of nutritional compromise? So I'm going to put Rayleigh on the spot a little bit and ask her that, and I'd love anyone else to chime in.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I certainly can.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I would love for some other people to jump in on this, but yes, I think it's so important that SLPs get education in nutrition. I mean, I think when I was going through my PhD, I kind of got into this whole world of homeostasis and nutrition, and I didn't realize how complex it is. And I think, you know, when we talk about getting education, I think it's not necessarily to say like, I am a master of all these things, I know all about, you know, nutrients and all these different things, but I think it's just to have some level of appreciation and awareness for the complexity of these issues. So again, that we can feed into that really collaborative approach that we're hoping people will start, you know, thinking about and trying to adopt as well. And I think it would be of benefit, you know, to do maybe some sort of like mini nutritional assessment or some sort of validated, just like quick screener to add in. Again, you're not trying to take over the role of the dietitian, but you're just trying to have some sort of information, because I do think that it can really help guide clinical decision making if you're aware on some level of your patient's nutritional needs and nutritional requirements. But like I said, I would love to get some more input from the audience as well.
I'm unmute Caroline if that's okay with you.
Yeah,
And I'll have
Liz, if you want to put my video on, you can go ahead and do that. I feel like I'm in a cave right now.
Yeah, let me see if I can. It'll probably prompt you here.
My mouse while my keynote is up.
And Rayleigh, you're welcome to turn on your video as well. All right, let me see here if Caroline was able to unmute herself. Caroline, you should see a button on your screen that has a microphone that lets you turn on your speaker. Yes, we should be able to hear you now.
Okay, great. So this is a clinical question with a real patient. Long history of head and neck cancer. Sorry, I should preface this. I work in a rehab center. And so this is a fellow coming from the acute care hospital, admitted for pulmonary problems. Probably, I don't know, it's not clear if it was aspiration related, but anyway, a lot of pulmonary problems. On video swallow, he had a severely impaired, essentially not a swallow, but he was eating up until that point. I'm not sure how, but he was determined. He's a very active fellow, splitting wood to heat his house, etc. And he came into the hospital, was about to go home on his peg tube, but he was determined to go back to eating. And so my question is, you know, can I tell him safer things to eat, even though really nothing is very safe? Or do I really have to stick with the line that, sir, you really shouldn't be eating and I can't help you?
Yeah, so that I think, you know, part of this, the answer to this is going to be a bit of my personal opinion on this, which is that I don't think it's our job at all to tell people what they can and cannot eat. I think our job is to provide patients with the objective information about what is happening with their swallow, what their physiology is, and that's why I think it's really important to involve team members with this, to give the patients the education to make informed decisions about whether or not they want to eat. So I would never tell a patient, no, you can't eat this, because what is risk, right? Like, do we really know what is risky for one patient may not be risky for another patient? There's just too many factors involved that play into that, and I think it's an individual decision. Did you want to chime in on anything with that, Ray?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I have a slightly different background, that most of my work has been done with patients with ALS. So obviously, you know, that's a terminal illness, and we would, same thing, have those conversations about, hey, this is what your swallow looks like based on this. You know, these are the types of things that maybe you should be eating. However, like patient autonomy, right, and patient decision. And so a lot of them would actually say like, that sounds great, but I only have like limited time left. I'm going to like enjoy my beer and my hamburger. And I had to be okay with that as a clinician at some point and just say, okay, I've given them the information. And so the patient has the right to decide. It's really their choice.
Yeah, I almost felt like I would be doing a better service to, you know, he's going to eat, right? So if I can help him make some better decisions around that, that's more useful than saying, I can't, you know, I can't condone what you're doing, right? That, as you say, it's not my role. Yeah, I was getting a lot of.
I don't think it's our job to condone or not condone what patients decide that they want to do. I think our job is, you know, just like the quote that Riley said earlier, is like to help prepare patients for the variety of foods that they need. And sometimes that comes with aspiration, and sometimes that's okay. It really, you know, like I said, I think we have such an emphasis that aspiration is scary, and I think that that's not necessarily always the case. So,
yeah.
So to kind of piggyback off of that, you know, I'm going to pose another question before I move on to just one more thing, which is, do we think that a silo mentality on identifying or eliminating aspiration, coupled with a lack of training in dietary science, kind of overrides the actual purpose for eating, which is maintaining positive nutrition and hydration? I think that this kind of piggybacks off of that patient question. And maybe we're kind of beating a dead horse with this, but Ray, what do you think about that?
Ooh, sorry. I think that there's a bit too much emphasis at times placed on, like you said, it's not, and sometimes it's not even aspiration itself, it's just this risk. And I'm not really sure how people are, you know, measuring or quantifying that risk and things like that. So I think what gets so lost in all of this is, what is the patient going home to actually be eating? And are we really preparing them for those types of experiences? And like you said, sometimes that does come along with some aspiration and things like that. So like, okay, let's have those kinds of questions. But I think that we get a little bit too honed in on just trying to create the most pristine, clean, you know, perfect eating environment for our patient. But then when they leave our clinical setting, they're going home to a home that isn't going to be that. So how do you prepare them for the real world, essentially?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to move on real quick before I ask one more question, because I became really interested in working with Ed Bice and Dr. Galick on this idea of, well, what are speech pathology practice patterns for consulting dietitians and having them be part of the team when making diet alterations. So Ed and Dr. Galick invited me to kind of be part of an idea that they conceptualized, which is to do a survey and just look at some of these practice patterns. So the purpose of this survey was to better understand current SLP practice patterns for consulting dietitians, and to investigate how things like work setting, years of experience, educational background, or even different patient diagnoses may influence those practice patterns. This is unpublished data that's currently in reviews, and I just want to give you a little like taste of some of the trends that we saw. So we looked at 359 practicing SLPs who practice dysphagia management who completed this survey. We asked them things like, what is your work setting? How long have you been treating swallowing? We asked them if they took a course concerning how to determine a diet level, but also a question on if they'd ever taken a course on what is the impact of modified diets on hydration and nutrition. And now all of you after this could say, yes, I actually have taken a course on that. And then we asked them, okay, in the past year, how often did you consult a dietitian in advance of making a diet recommendation? And if so, what were the different diagnoses that would prompt a discussion with a dietitian before recommending a diet? So real quickly, what we saw overall of all 359 participants, the trend was that about a little over 40% said that they never or rarely consulted a dietitian before making a diet recommendation. About 30% said occasionally, like 11 to 40% of the time. Even less said that I do it pretty often, so 41 to 70% of the time. And even less than that, routinely or almost always are consulting a dietitian, 71 to 100% of the time. So we were really interested in like, well, who are these people that are always recommending, and who are the people that are never? What kind of demographics may influence that? And my initial thought was, well, probably those, I would hypothesize that those who work in, especially in acute care, would probably be consulting dietitians way more frequently than those in other settings, because they have such direct access to a dietitian, and that just really wasn't the case. So we showed that 40% of those who work in acute care never or rarely consult a dietitian. And that's pretty consistent across the board. And what we found when we did some statistical analysis to look at different odds ratios, we found that work setting actually had no impact on how frequently an SLP consulted a dietitian. It was pretty low across the board. We wanted to look at, did the type of courses that they had taken in the past influence that? So of all of the participants, 64 respondents indicated that they had taken a course on how to determine a diet level, but this had no impact on the consult frequency for consulting a dietitian. Interestingly, though, 46% had attended a course on the impact of modified diets on hydration or nutrition. So this was very similar to like a course like this. And these individuals, which is the only statistically significant result, they were almost 2.5 times more likely to consult a dietitian prior to making a diet modification. So this really showed us that there's really room for improvement to educate speech pathologists on how important these decisions are to be able to consult dietitians and make them part of our team-based decision-making approach. So, right, I'm gonna ask you another hard-hitting question, and then maybe we'll call on somebody from the audience, who knows?
Yeah.
How do we best collaborate with dietitians, and what is the role of the patient? And if there are any dietitians in the audience, please feel free to speak up, because we'd love to hear your input as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna take a stab at this question here, but I see a couple of hand raised and some other people have some questions rolling in. So I'll answer very quickly and then we'll let some other people jump in. I think the first step is just like finding out where these people are, making some sort of interaction. I mean, like, when I worked in the ALS clinic, when I was a master's student, something that was really important was that we knew who the dietitian was. We were very cordial with her. We sought her out, and I feel like those little interactions, we really started building a really nice relationship, in that setting. And so it just got to the point where it was just like, we were like a well-oiled machine, because I kind of like started to understand the types of things that she would be recommending for patients. They knew my needs. We were working in tandem, making sure that we didn't like overstep our time boundaries and things. It was just like a really beautiful relationship. But I think it started with kind of those almost like small friendly interactions, just to say like, hey, who are you? Like, let's talk about what your role is this and my role in this as well. And of course you have to, I think if there's anything I could say, like, just remember from this talk is like the patient is at the center of this. We have to make sure that their needs are being represented, and that even when we're having all these discussions, I mean, patients, they want to be involved. This is their life that, you're affecting. And I think I say this from the place of being a patient as well. Sometimes it can feel a little bit like everyone's making decisions for you and your life just starts getting siloed into this like corner. And you're like, okay, like this is not even my life anymore because everyone's telling me what to do, where to go, what appointments to be at, et cetera, et cetera. So anywhere that you can kind of like empower the patient to be involved in their decisions, I think is super important. So Elizabeth, I don't know if you can unmute some people that have their hand raised so they can jump in and either talk about this question or some of the ones that we talked about before.
Yes, I have 3 people lined up and I'll list them here just so they know when to be expecting to have their mic turned on. I have Shannon, Elena, and Megan lined up. I'm going to let Shannon go first here, so I'm going to unmute her. And then Shannon, if you can click your microphone button, you're on the air. Yep, you're good.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Feels like
Great.
talk radio. You're on the air.
I'm a speech pathologist working with head and neck cancer patients in Canada. And so my question was, do you know if people ever use like a known calorie meal, say under fees, to see how long, like how many swallows, how much time it takes to get that known calorie meal down to kind of calculate these things that you're talking about in terms of energy expenditure and nutritional intake?
I'm not really sure if that is being done, but I think it's a great idea actually, because it goes back to that calculator that's in there where you can kind of calculate the different caloric costs of different activities that we do. And so I think that would be a really interesting way to look at that question. I don't know, Ava, do you know if anything like that is ever done? You worked a bit more.
I haven't seen anything like that. I mean, it's hard because, you know, calorie density can be so different, right? Like, and it just brings me back, like, Ray, you really like struck me when you talked about, like, I think we focus so much on calories, but it's so much more about like the quality of our food and the micronutrients that we're getting too. So, I mean, I guess I would take it one step further and say, like, how long does it take to get the nutrition that we need, not just like the number of calories? Because I know I can go eat like a glob of peanut butter and you probably get like tons of calories, but it's not going to give me the micronutrients that I need to really to heal. You know, if I was a patient that had sustained some sort of trauma or injury, those micronutrients are even more important to me than just like straight up calories, right? For healing. And I think about foods that are really dense in micronutrients, that are lettuces, vegetables, that they take a while, you know, they're complex, they're textured. So I think it's a great question. Yeah, I definitely don't think that study has ever been done, but
Yeah. Interesting food for thought. Yeah. Yeah. Try it out. Report back to us.
I'm going to unmute Elena here.
Great.
All right. You should be able to turn on your microphone here. Yep, you should be good.
Hi there. Hi there. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's been wonderful. I just have a quick comment. I've been in the profession for many years, and early on in my profession, I had a patient, a psychiatrist actually, and he was aspirating on everything basically, and silently, mainly the thin liquids. And he says to me one day, you know, you're projecting your fears on me. And it just stopped me in my track. And I was like, you know, he analyzed the situation perfectly, and it was quite humbling for me, and it got me thinking. And to this day, he haunts me. And what he said, and it's just, I find myself, you know, thinking about him a lot when I make my decisions. And so that's it.
yeah, that's really interesting. And you know, that fear is often, I find, associated with the emphasis on aspiration, right? Like, we're so afraid. I'll never forget, I heard a speech pathologist say to me once, like, I don't care, aspiration not on my watch. And I was so struck by that. I was like, wow, it's like, you know, a part of this is like the way that medicine has evolved, that we're also specialized. Like, everybody has their own specialty, and it's like that's a product of that, right? It's just like, I don't know, my job is to keep things out of the airway. And like, you know, when it comes to dietitians, I think sometimes we consult dietitians after the fact, which is, to me, is a little backwards. And you know, to be fully transparent, I used to do this. I would put patients on thick liquids and then consult RD for a calorie count, to be like, make sure they're getting enough food, right? Like, now that I've handed you this mess, like, and I'll never forget, you probably know, Eleni, is when I worked at Hopkins, Dennis Meyer, shout out to him, 7th floor on the transplant unit, dietitian, was like, homegirl, this guy's diabetic. He can't take his medications. Like, the medications he needs are crushed. Like, explain to me how bad this person needs thickened liquid, that it's going to cost him this whole host of issues that we're going to have to deal with. And he has a lot of wound healing that needs to happen. And I was like, oh, yeah, maybe he doesn't need thickened liquids that bad. Like, really, when you balance it out and you think about this cost benefit analysis, like, the decisions that we are making for our patients, we don't need to be making them for our patients, and we shouldn't be. Because it influences so many aspects. So I'm just going to do one summary slide, and then we can kind of open it up to all sorts of questions and discussions. And I wanted to just, the summary, I just wanted to have like just one thing that we remember, which is that this is challenging. There is a really important clinical challenge of maintaining swallow safety, yet avoiding more systemic health risks, such as dehydration and malnutrition. And I think, you know, as Ray and I programmed this and talked about it, I think our main takeaway was that we're not saying not to think about airway protection and to not think about the, you know, the recommendations that we make. What we want is everyone to walk away from this thinking, I need to be thinking about all of these factors together. And that this is, we can't have like this siloed approach on swallow safety. And this is coming from somebody, I spent my whole PhD studying airway protection. Like, so if I can do it, like anybody can do it, but like, we need to be thinking about the whole influence of these decisions on more than just the airway, on their ability to get energy in their functional reserve and avoiding these frailty states, because our decisions are going to impact so much more than just aspiration and airway safety. So anyways, I'd love to open it up if anybody has more questions or wants to, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can.
Yes,
There we
and here's your video. Excellent. Megan, you're welcome to turn on your mic if you want to ask a question or make a comment. If you click the green microphone button, it should turn on here. Let's see, I know she's busy putting, there you go. Yep, you should be good.
Oh, excellent. I really appreciate the seminar, and I've been in the field for a couple of decades, and I think as speech pathologists, we're always walking that tightrope of patient autonomy and patient safety. And one thing that has informed my practice is that I worked with a gentleman back in 2003 who wanted quality of life, specifically grilled foods. He loved grilled foods. And he ended up having a sentinel event, eating a hamburger. And imagine what happened after that. We got a call from the state. 10 people showed up. His medical record was scrutinized. A $60,000 fine was levied against the facility. His estranged daughter showed up and was devastated. So, right, this is real.
Right.
I will not forget that. That haunts me. As the last speaker said, the psychiatrist haunts her. That gentleman who wanted grilled foods and then had a sentinel event eating a hamburger haunts me. I wish we had more clinical guidance from ASHA. I wish we had a safe haven, because it's all fine and good giving our patients autonomy until the sentinel event occurs, and then it's you and your license and the state.
Yeah. I'll just say really quickly, I mean, I think these are very real concerns. And, you know, again, we're not saying that you shouldn't necessarily consider these different things, because as you're demonstrating, there are real, you know, consequences. But I think we do need to take a step back. And why is this onus and burden really falling on the SLP? I think that's my kind of like bigger question about all of this too.
Agreed. But it does, because we're the one that does the diet order, and it has our signature on it. And that being said, I still every day lean towards autonomy for every single person that I can. And I do. And I think the big lesson for me was documentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when physical therapists discharge a patient home with a walker and they fall, they don't lose their license, right?
Correct.
So I think that we, you know, again, like just saying, I think sometimes that we almost put a lot of that pressure on ourselves, that it's going to fall back on us, that if we make a diet recommendation, that it's like we're telling the patient what to do. And I think that documentation is key to, again, like be really objective in our reporting about what happens in instrumental evaluations, and to provide the patient with that menu of information on what our evaluations tell us. And again, I don't think that something like an event like that, as tragic as it is, should take away autonomy from patients in the future. And I think that we still have
I
to.
agree. I think the autonomy doesn't need to change, but the reaction to events like that need to change. And we need to be better protected as professionals. Because let me tell you, it is you and your license and someone from the state, and you're sitting in an office. We just need more professional protection.
Sure.
Yeah.
Cool. I think there's a bunch of people with their hands raised.
Can we call on Ed Bice, because I feel like he already had his question prepared from like last
He did
night.
tell us he had a question before it started, so I think we have to let him.
We have to call on Ed.
You're welcome to turn on your mic.
Hi guys, how are you?
Hey.
So thank you so much. I appreciate what you've done. You know, I mean, obviously this is one of my passions, as Alicia has just shown that I spent time doing a study. So can you speak to some of the questions that have been asked? Can you speak to the balance of how, you know, what's more important, nutrition, swallowing? How do we merge these two things together and give up our egos? Because, you know, we want to be the most important, and we want airway protection to be the most important. Dietitians want nutrition to be the most important. How do we merge those two things and become egoless and patient-centric rather than profession-centric?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that I think it's really helpful to have like actual structured, like multidisciplinary meetings about these types of things for the patient, where the first item on the agenda is what the goals of the patient are. And every conversation that comes after that has to relate to what the goals of the patient are. I think it helps like take away our own biases towards what we do, right? So we diagnose swallowing physiology. So we want to talk about swallowing physiology, and that's what we always want to talk about. But if that has nothing to do with the patient's goals, then maybe we need to take a step back and be a little bit quieter and listen to the other members of the team. Yeah, I don't know. I think that just part of the problem, Ed, is like getting people in the same room. I think it's hard when it's like, well, I'm going to put my note in with my opinion, and then the dietitian's going to put their note in, and then the doctor's going to put their note in. And who's the one that's like coordinating all of these recommendations together to make these decisions? I think that's what's hard about like our medical model, is that like, well, I'm going to write my note, I'm going to put my recommendations in, and the dietitian can read it, and then they can decide on that. It's like, no, let's actually like, I don't know if we need like dietary rounds or something, like some sort of model where we can be together. And perhaps like a positive of COVID is like making this possible in a virtual environment, to just have a morning rounds 15-minute Zoom where we talk about, you know, what is best for the patient based on what their goals are. I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's the first thing that came to mind.
I think it's a great answer, and I would just like to emphasize, like, I think, you know, we talk a lot about patient-centered approach, and I think people know what that means, but I'm not sure it's implemented enough in practice. And I really do feel like that's, you know, where it needs to start. I remember when I was a graduate student, we did this exercise where we had to consider like a stroke patient that had communication issues, swallowing issues, physical mobility issues, and we ranked in order what we thought was the most important. And they were all different because they were all based on like, if we were in that situation, would I want to eat or would I want to be able to walk first? Would I want to, but we don't give the patients these types of choices. We just say like, okay, this is what you have to do. Like, and so sometimes what I want to say to like the clinicians is like, it's not about you. It's not about you. Like you said, Ed, we really need to figure out ways to remove the ego, because we just put too much of our own. I love what that the other commenter said, that like we project our own lives onto our patients, and we don't need to do that.
Yeah, so true.
Really, and Alicia, I want to be mindful of your time. Should we do one more question, or should we kind of wrap things up here? It's up to you.
Let's do one more and then we can call it.
Yeah.
Is that good? All right.
And we can also, like, I'm happy to stay on for a little bit longer. We can kind of wrap up, and if Ed has anything he wants to conclude, and if others want to stay on for another like 10 minutes or so and just chit chat, I'm happy to do that as well.
Yeah, same. Happy to keep the discussion going.
Excellent. I'm going to unmute Chloe. She had a question here for you. So Chloe, you're welcome to turn on your mic. Yep.
Hi, I actually typed out the question. It's quite long, but I think in short, I would like to ask about whether or not you think we can shift the emphasis from speech therapists being the gatekeepers of swallow aspiration risk and swallow safety, because I think just with the Langmore study, we know that dysphagia is not the biggest contributor to the development of aspiration pneumonia, and there's actually a lot of things the multidisciplinary team can work on to reduce that risk. For example, ensuring oral hygiene is good. The PT can work on mobility, getting the patient out of bed or even sitting out. The OT can work on dependence for oral feeding, which from Langmore study, I mean, that's the one with the biggest odds ratio that actually contributes to the development of aspiration pneumonia in the first place. So I think increasingly my mindset is more on how to change the medical team's perspective and reaction. I think what someone shared just earlier was that when something goes wrong, they look to the speech therapist, and I don't think that's right, because anything can go wrong. A patient can have a heart attack while eating and they can choke, and it's not our fault. But anyway, it shouldn't be our fault. We should be the experts in dysphagia, in that we can integrate all the information about the patient's medical condition, their swallowing physiology, their risk for aspiration, and then present it to the patient in a manner that enables them to make their own decisions. So more that we can empower them, so that if they choose to take the risk, they know why and they know exactly what risk they're taking. And but we need the medical team to be on board with that.
Yeah. I know one thing that I started doing was how do you promote this de-emphasis? That's a good question. I think there's some simple things that you can do. One is to stop writing in notes what your diet recommendation is. Like, in a way, like when I first started practicing, it used to be like recommended diet, recommended liquid, and it was like a prescription. You had to like make this. And I just started getting rid of that, and I would really focus on like the physiology, the objective information about swallow, and I may make a note like on educated the patient on what happened during the swallow, and then just note what the patient decided that what this was. And I think when the doctors read that enough, and you can have a conversation with them to be like, it's not my role to tell the patient what they can and cannot do. My job is to educate on their swallow capacity and to have them make that decision. I think the more that you have those conversations and you reflect that in your note writing, it's a hard culture to change. I get that, but you have to start somewhere, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think we can definitely add that to our documentation. But the situation in my country, because I'm not from the United States, it's actually legally mandatory for us to make a recommendation. We cannot have our case notes without the speech therapist's recommendation. So how we get around that is that usually we would recommend. So for example, if the patient did a video fluoroscopy study, and the best consistencies in terms of reduced aspiration risk and swallow efficiency is, for example, maybe purate diet and mildly thick fluids and nectar thick fluids. We would have to write that based on our objective assessment, suggest mildly thick fluids and purate diet by whatever mode, But then we would put a line below that to say that we've discussed with the patient and talked about everything, so and so on. Patient is not keen for these modified consistencies. Patient would rather opt for minced, so and so on. But because of the nature of the culture in my country, being an Asian country, the fear of litigation is very, very high. And there's a lot of defensive medicine being practiced. So they want us to label this as at own risk feeding. Some places are even more, I don't know what's the word, even more extreme, in that they get the patients to sign a form to say that you have selected to eat at your own risk. So if anything happens, it's not our fault. I think this is a problem, but this is a bigger problem that I cannot change. But I think that what you said to add in about what we discussed, and that it's also about patients having the autonomy to make informed decisions. I think that's important. But thank you for the talk today. There's a lot of good things. I did want to ask, what is a good nutritional screener you think we can do as speech therapists to include into our assessment?
Yeah, so I have started, for my research, I'm using the mini nutritional assessment. They have a short form, and I can't remember, because I know for the longer form, there's like a couple of, like, let's say, like hand circumference like measurements that you have to take, but I'm not sure if they're on the short form as well. But, yeah, so, but there are some, clinical scales, but this would be a good opportunity, again, to maybe work along with your registered dietitian or somebody in your facility and say, hey, are you taking this type of measurement if you don't have access to the assessment tool? So it's a really good opportunity for collaboration there too.
Okay, I'll check that out, because I think it's like you said, it's a good way to collaborate. Currently, what we do for things like cognitive communication assessment, because in my institution, it's the occupational therapists that do the MOCA. But we'll check if they've done it. If they haven't done it, we'll ask them to do it. So I think the same thing. We'll check if the dietitian has done an assessment. If they haven't done it, then we'll ask if they are intending to, and then we can just take their readings, their values, and then go from there.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for your question.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
I'm going to turn this over to Ed quickly to wrap things up. And then if you want to stay on, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I know all the questions are stored and we can send those to you after the webinar. And perhaps in the future, if you want to come back just for kind of a coffee hour discussion, I'd be happy to arrange for that too.
Sure.
So I'm going to take back this slide sharing here. Give me just one second.
Actually, Riley, would you mind popping back on? Thank you. First, that was a great framework for looking at energy needs versus energy intake. I had not seen the spoon analogy before. I wanted to ask a question. Is there a way to quantitatively measure or assess one's reserve levels?
So, okay. Yes, and different. It's system dependent. So, for instance, like we can look at lingual physiologic reserve. We can look at how much how much maximum tongue strength a person has versus their swallowing, what they need for swallowing. We can calculate lingual functional reserve that way. Looking at some functional reserve systems in other organs and physiological systems is a little bit harder. And also just understanding what a person's total functional reserve might be, because it's just the aggregate or the sum of all those different things, is also a little bit harder. But I think that you can kind of just, again, if you look at things like just activities and tasks that a person's involved in every single day relative to the types of nutrients that they're getting and things like that, we can kind of infer a bit of this information about someone might having lower versus more higher reserve and things like that. But it's hard to quantify, but actually I think patients on some level, like I said, I think they're kind of aware of like how much energy or how much like of an energy budget they have for that day. So
I think you're right about that. Many patients are very much in tune with their bodies. And so they know, or at least many of them do.
Right, absolutely.
Alicia, you had a wonderful emphasis on educating the patient so that they can make informed choices. I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment, but I'll ask. Many of their compensation strategies, such as a hard swallow or coughing, lead to a non-social eating style. And so, do you agree with that? And if so, have you come across that? And how have you balanced that?
It's a great question. I think it really comes back to the cost benefit analysis. So here's where my brain goes when I think of things like this. When I started practicing early, my mentality was I'm going to give everything to the patient because I want them to have the safest, most beautiful swallow that they can possibly have. So I'm going to have them do an effortful swallow. And then after you swallow, go ahead and cough, maybe turn your head, alternate your liquids and solids. And if I really reflected on that, I would be like, was that for them or for me? Because I wanted a beautiful swallow, even though they are ridiculous in a restaurant right now and they don't even want to go eat because they think they have to do all these things. So now my thought is, what can I give my patient for a maneuver that gives them the most bang for their buck, but minimizes all these other aspects? The social aspect that minimizes their energy, like how many spoons they're going to need to do it. I mean, I used to recommend effortful swallows with every sip all the time. And it was really through like talking with Rayleigh a lot. I'm like, this is insane that I would recommend this. There's probably something else that I can do that wouldn't make them, you know, use so much energy. So, and I think the social aspect of it is another perfect example of that. So I think what I would say to speech pathologists is, if you're adding that one more thing, like a cough after a swallow, is it making a dramatic improvement in their swallowing, or are you tweaking? Or is it making it like 2% better and that makes you feel better? Because that cost benefit analysis may not end up in the way that you the way you think it is if you really put that perspective on it. So I think that bringing up the social piece is a huge other layer to the other factor of energy.
Thank you for providing that insight that you've come to after many years. I just want to once again thank both of you for joining us tonight. The questions, it seems like there are dozens that that we didn't get to, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. This was a lot of fun for us. So
yes, thank you for having us.
You're welcome. I'm going to take a minute to wrap up and then we'll be done. So I want to thank those in the audience that stuck around to the end. If you did have a question that wasn't answered, would you have it saved, or you can email us at info@nfosd.com, and we'll try to get you an answer to your question. An email will go out tomorrow, just looking for feedback on this webinar, and there'll also be links to resources that you might find of value to you. Our next webinar is about a month from now, and our keynote speaker is a member of the NFOSD Board of Directors, Lisa Blumenfeld, and she'll be talking about head and neck cancer survivorship. And with that, Rayleigh and Alicia, do you want to end the call now, or do you want to continue the discussion?
Alicia and I are always up for discussion. So how about we stay on for another like 10 to 15 minutes if people have like burning things they want to, talk about or ask questions about. We're happy to stick around.
Yeah, and feel free to turn your cameras on if you want and just have a drink. I don't know. We can chit chat a little.
I think there are some questions that we are. Can you see the questions in the
I
box?
can.
Okay.
I didn't know who's actually left and hanging around though. So
okay.
Give permission to anybody who had pressed the question mark button to turn on their microphone. And then they can just kind of duke it out to see who goes first.
Nice.
Okay.
Can I ask a quick question? Can anybody hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. I am like so thrilled to talk to you or to speak to you both. I've read at least one of y'all's papers and I'm hoping to read more of yours. Dr. Robeson. So this question that's been burning me up lately because we talk about swallowing safety so often. I'm talking about this actively at work right now because we're trying to sort of scoot forward kind of with my program a little bit, trying to move away from being the diet and cough police, which is the whole thing. It's tough because there's a lot of fear-based decisions and sentinel events, they're scary. So here's what I keep coming back down to. It's like obviously a very SLP-centric question. We talk about swallowing safety, but we don't have good evidence or any evidence of a relationship between prandial aspiration and aspiration pneumonia. Aspiration pneumonia itself is pretty squishy and undefinable. I've tried and it gets kind of messy. And so I'm like, okay, if we have an idea of safety with PTs that's pretty clearly defined, what outcomes can we tie swallowing safety to? And I'm like, I've been in my head, I'm like, I feel like the safest thing for patients is maximizing the comfort and efficiency of their intake so that they can meet their nutritional goals. Like I can't think of a better one because I also don't know, like, is there a better way to evaluate choking risk? Like, I mean, I've never had one, God forbid, yeah. But I don't know if you all ever thought about that, but it's been great.
I think we're both laughing. It's just like where we live, we think about this all the time. I'm going to let Alicia take this because she's like airway protection queen, but.
Right? I don't think we can. I don't think safety is like a word we should, I know it's like it's like in a definition, with airway safety. I mean, I think there's ways to like, we use the term because that's how we can like differentiate aspiration from residue, right? We talk about airway safety, we talk about efficiency, but I don't think we can. And I don't even think that this is like after hours real talk on the webinar, I guess. I don't know. I don't think we can, and I don't think that we should. I don't think the answer is that we just haven't figured out the formula of like, oh, if your chest x-ray looks like this and then you multiply that by your frailty state or something. Like I don't think that there's an answer to that. I think safe is just so undefined. What does that even mean? I mean, even for PTs, like fall risk, like what does that mean? Like what is safe for a patient? Like they have scales and stuff, but like honestly, like I have a lot of patients that aspirate everything that they eat and they're fine.
Yep, me too.
So is that patient less safe?
I don't know.
Than a patient, like I don't have the answer to that. I think that I don't think it's normal for a person to aspirate everything that they eat, but I don't think that it's our job to use qualifiers like safety because that's what opens ourselves up to fear-based decisions.
Exactly. I feel like a diet recommendation has become this promise of some measure of safety.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because that's why we make recommendations, right? We make recommendations if this is going to be the best thing for you. That's our practice as medical professionals. I also happen to think that we teach right now, we teach speech therapists a lot about dysphagia, but don't actually teach them how to practice medicine. Just like a whole other thing, because we're sort of like, here's your safe diet. Like, and I'm like, oh my God, I have no idea what that is. I've been doing this for like, yeah.
And I think just, oh, go ahead.
No,
Go ahead.
That's it.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think tapping into, you know, what I was talking about earlier too, one of the things about eating is like our mental state when we're going in, like it actually like causes this like de-stress, like loss of tension. But if you tell someone like these things are safe, these things are unsafe, you're going to aspirate, you're going to choke. Now I'm going into every meal like, and it comes this fearful experience for patients where this should be, I love eating. Eating is one of my favorite things to do. And so if it was like overshadowed constantly by like, are you being safe? Are you like staying safe? Are you aspirating? Like it would just take so much of the pleasure of eating out of it for me. So I think we really have to think about like, what are we doing to our patients and their well-being by having these types of like fear-based discussions with them? Like, of course you want to be real, but let's also balance that with a little bit of like humanity as well and not set them up for this vicious cycle of just being terrified of eating.
I think
Like, can you imagine getting in your car every time you got, like, we all drive every single day, multiple times a day. Imagine every time you got in your car, somebody was like, hope you don't crash off I-95 and go into a ditch and roll your car over.
You would never want to drive. Yeah.
It could
you would
happen.
never wanna do it.
It could happen. But like, imagine getting into your car and thinking about that every single time you got in your car. Driving would be so stressful. And we know the risk when we get behind a wheel. We know it's way more than when we get in an airplane, but we do it because it's like our life, and that's quality of life, and that's how we get places, and that's just, you accept risks in life. And I think that I agree with you, Ray. Like, the more we just talk about like safety and aspiration, it's like, well, now we're just putting our patients on this vicious cycle of fear-based eating. Terrible.
You guys, I work for home care. My name is Lisa. And so I get them after you give them away. And I do things really differently. I work in a pretty rural area. I've been doing this for 25, 30 years, something like that. But I have people that have been silent aspirating for ages, whatever. That's not, they're going to eat, they're going to drink, they want to. So my point is teaching them, educating to some extent, and asking them a bunch of questions. I give them the eat 10, I give them a bunch of questionnaires, and I ask them questions. I say, knowing what you know, what do you want to do? And if they say, I want to eat everything, okay, so how do we make you strong enough to balance that? Are you going to be walking more every day if you can walk? Are you going to be using your little exercise bike that you can sit on? Do you want to do respiratory muscle strength training? We work on whatever we can to make them a stronger human being to be able to get through whatever aspiration might happen. But, that it's what you just said about driving. It's the same thing. Why would you take the same thing with driving? So,
I can turn it off.
Oh.
Sorry.
It's officially over. They're just still doing these.
Oh, somebody else is talking.
Somebody has their mic on.
But it's just, I really try to treat each human being as the individual that they are and listen to them, and then base whatever my knowledge is to help them on what they want as a human being. There's not a time I would say, you can't eat that. I'd say, you're putting yourself at slightly greater risk, but what do you want to do?
What's funny is that I've never met a speech pathologist. When I've asked this question, they all answer the same. If you were aspirating, would you put yourself on on a, would you make yourself NPO or put yourself on thick and liquids? And every speech
No.
pathologist goes, hell no.
Exactly.
Okay then. So
Exactly.
think about that. Why are you making this decision for your patients? Like, think about that. Every speech pathologist, they don't even think about it. They're like, oh my God, if I'm in the hospital, get a speech pathologist as far away from my room as possible. It's hilarious. I mean, it's funny, but it's like, let's not separate that. Let's think about that for a second, you know? It's
Well, and Dr. Coyle, this is his mission in life. You know, he's all about this, and I follow happily.
Oh, love it. Love it. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, you too. This was really nicely done and a really nice sort of throw out of important information that I hope all of us are starting to use more for patient-centered goals.
Yes, very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This is Elizabeth. I'm going to ask a question on behalf of one of the caregivers who's here on the call tonight. Her name is Lynette, and her son, her adult son, had an anoxic brain injury, and she's wondering how much decision can he have in making the choice to eat by mouth. Currently, he has a feeding tube.
Yeah. Is the question based like on a cognitive capacity or like as a minor?
Yeah, more as a cognitive capacity. If he's not able to understand what those risks are, can he still participate in those decisions?
Oh, that's a hard question. You know, I think that in situations like this, when you have somebody who's making, you know, a lot of your decisions for you, I'm assuming that, you know, the caregiver, you know, is helping to make some of those decisions. I think that when it comes to eating and pleasure, I think that, I mean, who am I to talk? I don't know. I'm not a caregiver, so like take this all with a grain of salt. But I think that in work, you know, having worked on like a TBI unit for a long time, I think it's not so much about like, oh, this person can't be a power of attorney to like make a decision about their care. I think it's paying attention to the patient's nonverbal cues about how much pleasure food brings to them. And even if they can't maybe verbalize that or like make legal decisions from a cognitive capacity, I think that taking into consideration like when this person is enjoying a meal or that they try to have like pleasure feedings or eat, maybe not eating for nutrition, but eating just for pleasure, things that are meaningful, like reading the nonverbal cues of like, what does that do to this person's life, right? Is it enhancing it based on like nonverbal cues? Oftentimes caregivers are the best at being able to read that, not clinicians who don't know the patient. So I think thinking about that is really important. It's, you know, like it's kind of like when we would bring patients in the hospital outside for the first time in months when they'd been stuck in the ICU and just watching, even if they didn't have communication, like watching their body language and you could tell that the neurotransmitters were like flowing through their body. They just glowed and that brought them so much joy, even though they couldn't articulate it. So I don't have a right answer for that, but I think that it's something to really think about and consider that maybe in that instance it is more about quality of life and not so much about nutrition if they have a feeding tube. I mean, obviously there's a lot of nuance in this. Like, I don't know why they have a feeding tube or what the details are, but just something to think about, I think.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, anybody else?
Yeah. Oh,
I think so. Hello.
Hi, sorry, I do have a question. So I was just wondering, like, do you think that making these recommendations or not making them would change based on the setting of practice? Like if you're working in acute care and ICU where, you know, there is more kind of a control over that environment and those recommendations can be implemented in a way where you do have a little bit your role is also informing like maybe how a PCA or a nurse is assisting with feeding and those types of things, like your recommendations are still playing a part in that, versus like an outpatient situation where the patient's not as critically ill and those decision-making abilities and potential consequences might be different.
Mm. Do you want to take that, Ray? Do you want me to chime in? What are your
I feel like
thoughts?
with your background, I feel like that's a good question for you.
I think that, so in acute care, I think that because the patient is in such a state of like healing, right? I mean, this is, if they're in acute care, they've suffered some sort of trauma, and there's the diet and all of those things make a huge immediate impact. And oftentimes the patient is relying on the team to be able to help guide those like complex decisions, whereas it's a little different in outpatient where that autonomy has been shifted a bit more on the patient themselves, just because of the nature of they're obviously not as sick anymore and they're regaining more independence in taking, like there's a moment when you shift from acute to outpatient where you have to, and Ray, you can probably talk about this, where like you really are shifting to like, oh, I'm the one that's driving my care now. I'm the one making appointments. I'm the one that's like the coordinator of my care. So I think that in outpatient, when we make recommendations, we have to work more with the patient to understand like who are the other specialists that you're working with and what else is going on, and like empowering the patients like, hey, I see you have an appointment with your pulmonologist on Thursday coming up in your calendar. Perhaps you should have this conversation with them and get their input. So I just think it like ends up shifting on like that ownership of the patient. I'm sure, Ray, you can talk about that. Like that, I'm sure that's a dramatic change.
Oh yeah. So for those who don't know, I spent some time in the medical ICU when I was a PhD student because I have scleroderma and pulmonary hypertension. And when I was in the medical ICU, I mean, every morning they're coming around, they stand out there, they do the rounding. It's like everyone's on the same page, what the expectations are. But then when I left, they sent me home with all these like new medications, these new expectations. And like, I find that the most difficult part about being a patient in the real world is that there's no longer that like rounding aspect. Like everyone's not on the same page, and it's like you're responsible for like coordinating all of your care. And so yeah, it's like you have so much more of a bigger patient responsibility when you get outside of those different types of settings. And so I think your autonomy is just like naturally increased by having, like Alicia said, just shifting from those different environment. So I think the expectations from like a nutritional swallowing standpoint are going to be different just in those two environments.
And that can be good and bad, right? There's pros and cons to that for sure.
Yeah, I definitely loved it better when people were making all the calls to the pharmacist and stuff for me. And now, it takes a lot more spoons to do those calls and coordinating myself. But then also I'm not in the ICU anymore. So that's, pros and cons, of course. So I don't want to keep everyone here all night. So how about we do like one more question? Would that be good?
Yeah. Speaking of spoons, I got to use my remaining spoons to put my toddler to bed.
Yeah. So if anyone has like one,
it takes like 5.
Or not.
Cool. Well, maybe it's a good time to wrap up.
Cool. Well, this was a lot of fun. Thank you guys for hanging in there with us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, good.
Appreciate it.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for organizing this as well. This was really well executed and really appreciate it.
Yes, we had a lot of fun. Thank you for having us.
Perfect. Have a great night, you guys. Thanks everybody for joining.
Bye.